I don't think there's ever been a better time to get involved in the pro-life movement than the time that we're in right now. God gave an extraordinary gift to this country in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. But as I've said in so many of these videos, Roe versus Wade doesn't end the need for a pro-life movement. It actually amplifies the need for a pro-life movement all the more. And as we've seen across the country, there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people throwing their weight into the pro-life cause. And it's a blessing here today to have David Bereit with us to talk about the pro-life movement and how one might best leverage their time, talent, and treasure for this most important cause in our country. David, you haven't always been involved in the pro-life movement. No. And I'd like to begin our conversation today by hearing a little bit about that. David, how did you get involved in the pro-life movement, and maybe share with us what we might learn from that?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I wasn't always involved. I actually grew up in Pennsylvania in a wonderful Christian home, but never heard about abortion, never heard it preached in my church. So I was blissfully unaware of what abortion was. And even once I eventually learned about it, I was like, ooh, that's controversial. I don't want to be involved in that. But God has a sense of humor, right?
Right.
So first, he introduced a woman into my life who's now my beloved wife of 30 years, Margaret. And Margaret had grown up in a pro-life family. And so she was always saying, we need to put our faith, our convictions into action on behalf of the unborn and the mother. But it didn't, I thought, affect me until the news broke in 1998 that Planned Parenthood was going to open an abortion facility in the town where I lived, of College Station, Texas. Wow. And that was when it all just came crashing down with reality. Children are going to die in my town on my watch. Women are going to be hurt in my town on my watch. What am I going to do about it? So a meeting was held at a local church, St. Mary's Catholic Center, across the street from Texas A&M. And a young church secretary, Lauren, organized that meeting. And my wife reluctantly dragged me to the meeting. And there were hundreds of people there from dozens of churches, and all saying, what can we do to try to prevent this abortion center from opening? And I thought, what can I do? I'm only one person. But that night at that meeting, I felt a conviction that God had a role for me. And so Margaret and I began step by baby step to volunteer, initially to pray at the site where the facility was being built. Regrettably, it did open. So then we began to help with sidewalk counseling efforts and help get people involved in the pro-life movement. Wow. And then I finally just recognized the magnitude of this crisis as the death toll from abortion was going up, as I saw women being wounded by this facility. And June 26th of 2001, I finally was convicted I needed to leave my job in the pharmaceutical industry, and I was asked to take the helm of a little pro-life group there called the Coalition for Life. I dove in. I didn't know what I was doing. I had never done this full-time. I didn't know how to run a nonprofit, but I recognized I have a role to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and I think we all do. So during those next few years, we ended up mobilizing dozens of churches and thousands of people, but a real turning point came in 2004 when, through an hour of prayer, we were trying to figure out what can we do to really get the body of Christ, get more people involved. We discerned what became 40 Days for Life. Yes. Through an hour of prayer, we felt that for 40 days, we needed to pray and fast, stand in peaceful vigil outside the abortion facility, and do grassroots community outreach, inviting other people to be a part of the solution. And 1,000 people got involved in that campaign, and abortions dropped by 28% in our town.
Wow.
God showed up
28% in a single year.
Over 100 lives
people
were saved.
Praying.
People praying,
wow.
And people putting their faith into action.
Yeah.
So then 40 Days for Life on its own initially began to spread to other cities. And in 2007, I stepped into the leadership role as the beginning of 40 Days for Life as its own organization. And I led that for a decade. And I watched God grow it to 42 nations, all 50 states, hundreds of cities, 750,000 volunteers. Wow. And even today, as it continues to spread, now more than 1 million people have participated in these campaigns. And we've seen more than 20,000 lives that we know of that have been spared from abortion. We've seen over 100 abortion centers close their doors and go out of business. And more than 200 abortion workers have had a change of heart and left the abortion industry. Wow. We know the story of Abby Johnson, told in the movie Unplanned. But when I look back, you asked about lessons from this. When I look back and say, what did I do and what can others do? Number one, I recognized the problem. Instead of trying to hide it under a rug, I allowed my heart to be broken for the child and for the mother. Yeah. And then I said, I've got to be a part of the solution. Number two, I've got to do something. I don't know what. So the third step was to assess my own gifts and talents and experiences. There weren't many, but what could I do with what God's given me? How can I make a difference? And then fourth, recognizing that I want it to be his will, not mine, I prayed and said, God, thy will, not my will. And that's a dangerous prayer because sometimes he'll lead you into places you weren't expecting to go. But then fifth is to get started somewhere.
Right.
And then
Right.
the sixth is to grow. And the seventh step for me was continually assess and improve and refine what we're doing. And that trajectory is what took me from a reluctant person who wasn't involved to not only leading what became a worldwide movement, but today I get to advise and consult with most of the top pro-life organizations and leaders and see great things happening across the entire movement. Only God can do that, but we have to be his hands and feet and humble ourselves and say, thy will, not my will.
Wow. Yeah, David, let me just pause for a second and say thank you for the extraordinary gift that you have been to the pro-life movement. You started out in the pharmaceutical industry. I didn't know that. And then went on this entirely different path that, as you said, 750,000 volunteers, 20,000 that you know of, lives saved, droves of workers having changes of heart and leaving the abortion industry. You've done so much, and not only did you found this organization, now I know that you're a full-time pro-lifer. This is what you're doing. And so I feel very privileged to hear you answer some of these next couple questions. So you walked us through your own progression here, how you got involved in the pro-life movement, broke your heart, you dove in, you took action, you asked God, to send you in the right direction. What advice would you have reflecting on your story for other people? And then I'll take that a step further and say, of the things that are out there, just how can people get involved? Yeah. Very practically, what can they do?
Yeah. So we'll take those 7 lessons I learned just briefly. Number one, for you, the person watching this video, is recognize the problem. This video series has helped to illuminate what abortion actually is and the harm that it's causing, and allow that to break your heart. This is a real crisis, the greatest human rights crisis of our generation, the leading cause of death, abortion. So recognize the problem, but then determine, I'm going to be a part of the solution. I'm going to do something. I don't know what, I'm going to do something. Third, assess your own gifts and talents. Say, what skills, what experiences, what blessings, what things has God shown me in my lifetime that I could possibly deploy in this cause? Then ask him through prayer, maybe even fasting at certain seasons. Say, God, show me my place. And then find your place to start getting involved or get a little bit more involved. And then grow. Just allow God to grow, work with others, recognize you're not in this alone. It's a greater movement. And then continually assess and say, how can I improve? So take those 7 steps and then look at the entirety of the pro-life movement. I think of the pro-life movement in categories of activity. So maybe for a person watching right now, it's get involved in faith-based efforts. Maybe it's to start up a pro-life group at your church or get involved in a pro-life group. Maybe it's to lead a pro-life Bible study. Maybe it's to pray. Maybe it's in certain seasons to fast. That's one possibility. Another one, probably one of the most important facets in this post-Roe climate we're in, is pregnancy help. Yes. So number one, if you encounter somebody facing an unexpected pregnancy, say, I will help you, and mean it, be alongside them. 74% of women who've had abortion said if one person had offered to help them, they would not have had an abortion.
Let's pause it. 74%, if they had been offered, say that they would not have gone through therapy.
Absolutely. And
Incredible.
So if we meet that person, we need to be willing to say, I will help you. And then you say, well, what can I do to help? Well, first, get involved with a pregnancy center. And they're all over the country.
Yeah, you said in a previous video, David, there's 2,700 crisis pregnancy centers around this country. So I got to think, for 99% of the people watching this video,
there's one in your backyard.
There's one in your backyard. Right. It's not hard. It's already been made for you.
Right. And so get involved with those pregnancy help centers, either volunteer or maybe donate to the local pregnancy help center, or at least know about them. So when you meet somebody facing unexpected pregnancy, you can connect them. And the same with maternity ministries. There's not as many maternity homes around the country, but my wife works at one. I'm on the board of a maternity ministry in Virginia called Mary Shelter. Yeah. Those are amazing because we get to house and come alongside women from horrific circumstances to show them that we love and care for them. So pregnancy help, vital, vital piece. Third piece. We've heard a testimony in one of the previous videos of someone who's experienced the pain of abortion. There is such a need for post-abortion ministries to help those who have been through abortion to find healing, and then also to share their stories. I've seen U.S. senators who were previously advocating for abortion change their position after hearing one post-abortive woman's testimony. Wow. And so we need to hear those stories. We need to share those stories. Another area is education. Educate yourself on these issues. Not only watching these videos, certainly do that, share them with everybody you know, But go to your local pro-life organization, a Students for Life group, a Right to Life group, and say, tell me more so I can then educate others after educating myself. Another thing, what I did is go outside the abortion facilities. Do it peacefully, do it prayerfully, but go there to pray, go there to counsel, go there to be a witness. Where two or more gather in our Lord's name, he promises us he'll be present in our midst. And where is his presence more urgently needed than a place of despair that is an abortion facility?
Yes.
A couple of more things. There's civic involvement. There's getting involved in supporting pro-life legislation. There's getting involved in pro-life political campaigns. There's voting pro-life every chance we get, and making sure that we understand where candidates stands on abortion, regardless of what they claim about their faith and other values. Where do they stand on abortion? How do they actually legislate? And maybe somebody's even called to get involved in running for office one day. It's crazy, but hey, it may be a way that God could use you. Overall, advocacy, finding a way, going to a March for Life event, or advocating through a Students for Life group on your campus or in your community, or just simply making your voice heard. Write a letter to the editor, speak out in the media, write a letter to a company that is supporting Planned Parenthood and ask them to stop. Those kinds of things can change hearts and minds. So to your point, assess your time, your talent, your treasure, go through that process, look at the facets of the movement, and find a place to get started. Find an existing organization, take that first step, or if you can't find one, start up an organization, because we need more good people, more good organizations. We need more people advocating on behalf of life, and each of us has a role for such a time as this.
Wow. David, I can hear the passion, that's born from decades of experience in the pro-life movement. So thank you for the work that you've done. One final question.
Sure.
And I know that this question has enormous traction in your own soul, as somebody who's really given their whole career to the pro-life movement. Whatever career you would have had in the pharmaceutical industry or whatever you might have done didn't happen, but this did. For many of us, on the fringes of the pro-life movement, we're not talking about a whole career. We're talking about giving an hour or two a week. We're talking about giving, a portion of our giving budget to the pro-life movement. We're talking, about that kind of smaller suffering. Okay, so it's easy for somebody who's suffered a very little to ask a question: is the suffering worth it? But it's even a more important question for you. You've given up your whole career for this, so not only for your sake, but for all of us who might be thinking about throwing our weight into the cause a little bit more. Very direct question for you: has it been worth it to do that? Has it been worth it to engage in the pro-life movement in this way?
John, as you ask that question, my mind immediately takes me to Vukovar, Croatia.
Croatia. Wouldn't expect you to go that route, but here we go.
It's on the Croatia, small country made up of mostly Catholic Christians, that is part of the result of the breakup in the Balkan conflict in the early 1990s. And my family and I went to Croatia because 40 Days for Life was growing rapidly there.
Wow.
And one of the stops was in Vukovar, which is on the eastern border on the Danube River across from Serbia. And it was one of the areas hardest hit during the Balkan conflict. And when we went there, I went out and prayed outside of the hospital where abortions are committed in Vukovar. And it was a very dark place. The city still, you could feel the ominous presence of what had happened from the conflict decades earlier. But there were 100 people praying outside of the hospital. And they were singing and they were offering help to those going in. And it was like light piercing through the darkness. And after going to that vigil site, they said, we want to take you to a meeting. And they took me to a home. And we went in this little home, and I was greeted by a woman in a bathrobe, which I thought, this is going to be a very unusual meeting. But through a translator, this woman, Marinella, told me that she had gone to that hospital several months earlier for an abortion appointment. And those people were outside praying and offering help.
Wow.
And she went to them and she said, you have no idea the help I need. I'm in an abusive relationship.
Wow.
I don't have money. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. And they said, we'll help you. And they meant it and they lived it. They walked with her throughout the rest of her pregnancy. She chose life. They helped her to get out of the abusive situation. They helped her with medical care and housing. And as she shared through the translator, 2 weeks before I arrived there in Vukovar, she gave birth to a little baby girl she named Petra. And a woman walked around from the corner of the next room holding Petra in her arms.
Wow.
And Marinella placed Petra in my arms. And as I held this little girl, I thought how close she was to being a statistic. What if people hadn't been praying?
Wow.
What if people hadn't
Yes.
gotten involved in the pro-life movement, even through difficulties and challenges and fear? But because they did, this little girl's alive today. And that moment for me was worth everything. And I've only met a few of the children saved through all the pro-life efforts I've been involved in. I've seen pictures, I've heard stories, but she was one of the few I've met. But John, just a reminder, the reason my mind went to Vukovar, every year on that young girl's birthday, September 30th, I get a photograph of her growing up. And I just got one a few days ago. She is now 7 years old. She's in school. She's a beautiful young lady. And she and her mother now go to pray outside the hospital where she was almost aborted. It's so worth it. And I guess my challenge, my plea for a person watching us right now is get involved. Let God use you. Yeah. And as you do it, it will be hard. It will be challenging. But one day my prayer is that you get to meet a boy or girl who's alive because of your efforts, a mother who's spared from a life of regrets. And when you have that moment, when you meet that child, you'll realize how worth it this work actually is. So yes, it's worth it for me. And yes, it's worth it for each of us to be a voice for the voiceless, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to get involved in the pro-life movement. We need you now more than ever.